Good morning. It is Sunday, May 16th. It's the third Sunday in May. My name is Doug Griffin. This is my Sunday school lesson. We are going through the book of Genesis, and we have been looking at the children of Jacob. Okay, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons, and by four different wives. And so we've been studying uh, different sets of the kids and what happened to them ultimately, kind of based on what they were told, how they were born, what was put into their heads, and you kind of see a path that they basically followed. Um, so just to review, Jacob was tricked into marrying Leah. At least that's what Laban thinks happened, his father. Now, right before this, God had told Jacob, before he got to Laban, I got your back. I'm watching you. I'm going to keep you. I'm going to guard you. And Jacob, when he gets there, he immediately has his eyes on Rachel, and oh, she's the one I want. Even though Rachel's the youngest daughter, he thinks if I work for her, I can get her. But Laban tricks Jacob into marrying the older daughter, because that's the tradition in that country. The older daughter gets married first. So Jacob thinks, man, I've been messed up. Okay, I'll put up with Leah, but Rachel's the one that God wants me to have. But interestingly enough, Leah was the one that God continued his line of succession leading to the Messiah through. So in God's mind, that wasn't a mistake. Even though Laban was doing it for the wrong reasons, God blessed the line of Leah, not of Rachel, and certainly not any of these maidservants who Jacob also had children through, because their motivation was wrong. The sisters are competing with one another, and if you're doing something for the wrong motivation, God has to give you consequences for that, because he's trying to teach us to do things out of obedience to him, not out of anger for somebody else. He can't reward that kind of behavior. So Genesis chapter 29, just reviewing verse 31 to 32, it says, when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb. So Jacob is married to both women at the same time, Rachel and Leah. Actually, a day later, he married Rachel, but basically he's married to both of them at the same time. And yet God opened Leah's womb, and she's the one that had children. Uh, so God was making a statement. He says, open her womb, Rachel's barren. So Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, which means, ha, a son. Look, I got a son. So there. So, but she says, now therefore my husband will love me. So she kind of laid that on Reuben. It's up to you to get your daddy to love me. And when you put kind of those unreal expectations on a child, they're going to fall short. And Reuben had a pretty rocky life, and he lost his birthright as firstborn because he had an affair with his stepmother. Okay, so he didn't have a good life. Genesis 33, it says, then Leah conceived again, and she bore a son, and she called his name Simeon, which is that the Lord has answered my prayer, and also kind of put on him, you're going to be the person that brings my husband back to me, which is always the wrong reason to have a child. Now, it's not the child's fault, but if you keep putting that in that child's head, when it doesn't work out, the child, of course, thinks, oh, it's all my fault. They got divorced because of me. That's because you kept telling the child, you were born to save our marriage. Uh, so Simeon ends up becoming subordinate to Judah, which is his younger brother, and never took a leadership role. After Reuben screwed up, Simeon and Levi got together and they screwed up. Those were the next brothers in order. Um, Levi was supposed to be the reconciler, and actually his descendants were reconcilers. They were the ones that reconciled the people to God. They were the priests. But Simeon and Levi had an issue with their sister Dinah, and so they lost their rights as firstborn. And Judah, the fourth-born son, actually became the leader in Israel. She said she stopped conceiving after she bore Judah. This is Leah has had 4 kids in a row. Judah she called praise. Judah she didn't put anything on Judah. She finally was able to say, I'm just going to praise the Lord. And I've got this child, and I'm just happy for this child is here. I'm not going to look at all the circumstances. I'm not going to look at everything else. I'm just glad this child is here in my life. And Judah grew up with no pressure on him to solve her marriage. Judah grew up thinking, I'm here because she just loves the Lord. I'm here because God wanted me here. And that sort of thought in a child's head makes them thrive when they grow because they feel like they have a purpose. They're not here accidentally. They're not here to solve some problem. They're here because God has a purpose for them. And so Judah became a leader. So Leah has 4 kids. And then it says she stopped bearing. And we'll find out at the end of the lesson today why she stopped bearing. Did God suddenly make her barren or did something else happen? Okay. Uh, so Genesis chapter 30, we're just reviewing. Rachel sees that Leah is having kids and she's not. So she takes her maid and she says, here's my maid, Bilhah. Go unto her, she says to Jacob, and she will bear children on my knees. Meaning, I'm going to take these kids from now on, that I may have children by her. So that's why I can compete with my sister. Again, wrong motive. Not I want to do what God wants. I want to show up my sister. So she has a child named Dan. That's her first child, which means judgment, God's judgment. And Dan had a really rocky life. I want to talk a little bit about Dan. We went into his situation last week when Jacob, his father, prophesied over all of his kids. When he got to Dan, he said, Dan shall be a serpent, by the way, a viper in the path. This is Genesis 49, verse 17 and 18. He's going to be a viper that bites the horse's heel so that the riders shall fall backward. That's not a good sign that you're the one causing damage to other people, that you're going to be that snake like the one that was prophesied in the Garden of Eden. Uh, and he will bite your heel and you will crush its head. He's kind of saying you're going to be like the devil in these people's lives. However, the next line of that prophecy says, but I will wait for your salvation, O Lord. And I do think there is salvation also prophesied for the tribe of Dan. So let's talk about a little bit about the tribe of Dan. They were settled on the coast, uh, just north of present-day where the Palestinians are today, along the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Dan was right immediately north of them, and they were told that they were supposed to conquer that land, which they called Philistia, where the Philistines were. But Dan didn't do that. Dan split in half that tribe. Instead of going down and conquering the Philistines, half of them went up north. And last week we read how they killed an innocent group of people that weren't bothering anybody, and they take their land up north. And they began to build idols. And the northern tribe of Dan was really not good. However, there were some Danites who built ships because they're right on the coast, and they became this seafaring people. In fact, in Judges chapter 5, verse 17, when there was a big war that was going on between the Israelites and the Canaanites, Deborah, who was a prophetess, asked the question in Judges 5:17. He says, Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan, talking about Reuben and Gad. They didn't really come over to help. He says, and why did Dan remain on ships? So they've been building their ships, and they got in their ships and basically left, and instead of coming to help fight. So that's half of Dan got on ships and left. The other half went up north. Neither half conquered the Philistines in Philistia, which is today modern where the Palestinians are living. And that group that went on those ships became the Dans, or we would know them as the Danes, Danes. And they traveled, you can trace them through Denmark. Um, they were the word for man in the Bible is Ish, I-S-H. The word for Adam, the word for man is Ish. And so if you were a man of the Dans, you were Danish or Danish. and they traveled, and they became the Saxons who conquered. If you trace that line, and the United Kingdom, and the Britons, the Saxons comes from uh, the sons of Sac, S-A-C. Sac's sons are Isaac's sons, Isaac's sons, and so that's what they called themselves. We're Isaac's sons, and they just became the Saxons, and they are traveling down, and so you can kind of trace the tribe of Dan. They conquered the Ingles in England, the Angles, and became they joined with them, became the Anglo-Saxons. Um, and you can kind of follow their exploits. So the Bible says there's still a salvation. I'm waiting for your salvation when he after he gave that prophecy about you being a serpent, which the northern half of Dan was. They were a serpent, and they did terrible things we talked about last week. The other part of them that went to Europe, it says that there is salvation. Uh, so so the tribe of Dan is going to do some good things for God and may have already done it. But what they didn't do was conquer that area, Philistia, where the Philistines were. David, as you know, fought Goliath, who was a Philistine. And temporarily, David and Solomon had conquered that area. But I'm sorry, during the time of Judges, the Gaza Strip, where war is going on right now, um, Samson was taken and dragged to Gaza. The Philistines grabbed him, took him to Gaza, and then chained him to their temple, and that's the temple he brought down in Gaza. There's a lot of prophecies about Gaza in that area and what the Israelites should have done as far as taking that land and conquering it. Like I said briefly, David and Solomon conquered it, but then they got free again. And then when during the Babylonian captivity, they were carried away as well as the Jews by to Babylon. So that area actually had been empty for a while. Um, when the Jews went to Egypt and were there for 300 or 400 years, that's when the Philistines moved into that area. Because originally that land, because there's a big question like whose land is this? Who's originally it was all the Canaanites were there. Then God said to the Jews, I'm going to give you this land. And when they went to Egypt for 300 years, this people from Greece uh, they came down. They tried to conquer Egypt. They lost, and the Pharaoh in Egypt sent them up and put them along the coast again of what is Gaza Strip, and they became the Philistines at that point. And that's when the children of Israel came back, and God said, "You got to take care of them." And they said, "No, there are giants in the land." So they let them grow. Then you got it. The Philistines, as you know, were thorn in the side of Israel all throughout that whole history. The only time that Judea ever owned that area, which again today is the West Bank, Gaza Strip, is when during the time of Jesus, and the Romans helped the Jews to occupy that area. But once the Romans conquered that Judea area in 70 AD, they cleared out the Jews and they renamed that whole area Palestine. All of Israel was renamed Palestine as a way to just kind of, and again, Palestine and the Philistines and Palestine is the same word. They just called they called that whole area Palestine, kind of as a way of sticking in the eye of the Jews who had lived there all that time. Um, and then for thousands of years, from the time of 70 AD until today, Arabs actually had migrated into that area. And these were the children of Ishmael. So if you were to take a genetic test between the Palestinians today and the Jews, they're cousins. And there's very little difference in their DNA. They're all descendants of Abraham. So you've got cousins of Abraham who are fighting now. Those aren't the original Philistines who are there now. The original Philistines were taken to Babylon and just kind of disappeared. But these are the people who have been migrating are Arabs who've migrated to that area who are just cousins of the Jews. And that area has been a sign of contention for thousands of years. And I fault Dan. Dan was supposed to have cleared out that area a long time ago and never did what they were supposed to do. So they kind of are a serpent. Anyway, so Rachel through Bilhah, her maid, she has Dan, and then her second son she had was Naphtali. We talked about them. And Naphtali went to live up in the Gilead, Galilee area, in Galilee area, and that area got a bad name. Naphtali was carried off, along with Gad and Reuben and all the rest of them were carried off in the Babylonian captivity, and prophets would prophesy bad things about that area, which is why when Jesus came and they found out he was from Galilee, now he was actually from Bethlehem, but they thought he was from Galilee. They said, well, can anything good come from Galilee? Because that's where Naphtali and them had been. And there's all these bad prophecies about that area. So Bill has two kids. Not great things happen. And then we talked about Gad, because when Leah saw that Rachel's maid was having kids, she says, well, I want my maid to have kids too. And so she gave Zilpah, her maid, to Jacob, and they had Gad, and that's where we ended last week. And Gad was a horrible idol worshiper. And again, if the purpose of your having your children is to stick it in the eye of somebody else, in fact, if anything that you do is based on revenge and I'm going to open up this business so I can get back at that person, or I'm going to move here so I can, show them, God doesn't bless that, because we have the wrong motivations. We have to be doing things because we are being obedient to God, and not because we are angry at somebody else and we want to show them up. God's just not ever going to bless that. So that was the whole motive behind having Gad. I'll show up my sister. And Gad, who the region he moved to was called the Gadarenes, and we talked last week about the demonic of Gadarenes. And Gad means army, or troop, or legion. And when Jesus went there to the Gadarenes, the demon said, please don't make us leave this country. You know, our name is Gad, right? Our name is Legion. We've been here for a long time. So Jesus said, okay, you can stay. But, at a certain point, you're going to have to leave. That's why they said, are you come to torment us before the time? Because Jesus knows there's a time coming when they're all going to be in the lake of fire. So, okay, fine. Now, Zilpah had one more son, and that's where I'm starting this week. This is, again, Leah's maid. His name was Asher. And so in Genesis chapter 30, verse 12, it says, Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. And Leah said, I'm happy, for the daughters will call me blessed. So she called his name Asher, which means happy. So just like praise with Judah, she at least didn't call his name revenge or ha-ha on you. She gave him a nicer name. And so Asher, again, how you treat your children, or how you treat your neighbors, or how you is what you, because you sow whatever you reap. No, you reap whatever you sow. And if you're sowing discord and anger and revenge, that's what you're going to reap. But in this case, she sowed good things into Asher. In fact, the prophecy that Jacob gave about his son Asher, in Genesis 49:20, it says, bread from Asher shall be rich, and he shall yield royal dainties. Like, he's going to have a good life. And he did. Their tribe prospered because they felt really great about themselves. However, they never connected themselves to the promise of God. They never, these children were supposed to be born because of the promise to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, that God was going to bless them. But instead, they were born just to show off the other sister and to compete with them. And so the children never learned, you're here because God has this purpose for you. You're here because God has this thing that he's doing in your life. That's not what they learned. So they never really connected to the prophecies. They never connected to God in the way they should have. So although Asher was happy, in fact, Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 24, when Moses is blessing people, he says, and of Asher, he said, Asher is most blessed of sons. Let him be favored by his brothers. Let him dip his foot in oil. And that's a good thing, right? So Asher, because his mama named him Happy, he was prosperous. He felt good about himself, but he still never connected to what he was supposed to do. In Judges chapter 1, verse 31, when Asher moved into the promised land, in Judges 1:31, it says, Nor did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Acco or the inhabitants of Sidon or of, well, he lists a whole bunch of places. And in Judges 1:32, it says, So the Asherites dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. So they weren't obedient to do what God asked them to do. And there's sometimes God asks you to do something. You got to throw that out or get rid of that or cut that out. And you may not understand why. God can see down the road how that's going to be a bad influence on you, how it's going to mess you up in some way. And you think, I don't know why, but I feel like I should just throw this out. Yes, then follow what God is telling you to do. Asher never did. He dwelt among the Canaanites, and even though he was prosperous, and he just allowed that in, and it ultimately screwed him up. The good news is not all of Asher was bad. Even after the tribe of Judah, which included Simeon at this point and a little bit of Benjamin, even when they were taken off to captivity and came back, some of Asher's people came back with them. The majority of the 10, we'll say 10 lost tribes, they just dispersed. They never came back to the land that God had given them. They just never came back. Even though it was their land, they never felt connected to it because their parents never made them feel connected to it. But there was a remnant of each tribe that would come back to the land. So a few people came back. 98% of them left, but that 2% came back and did feel connected. So we hear about Asher in Luke. We hear about a descendant of Asher in Luke chapter 2, verse 36. It says, Now there was one, Anna, a prophetess, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was a prophetess, and she was waiting for the Messiah, and she caught the vision of what God was doing. And it says she was of a great age and had lived with a husband 7 years from her virginity. And then it goes on to say they brought her into the temple. She went, Oh, it's the Messiah. She believed, even though 95% of her relatives had gone on. She held on to what God was doing, and she was there to witness it happen. Um, so, so that's Zilpah's 2 kids. Now, going back to what's happening in this rivalry between these sisters, it says Genesis chapter 30, verse 14. Now, Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field. So Reuben's the oldest child, but at this point he's 7 or 8 years old. And he's out in the field and he finds these mandrakes. Now, the myth about mandrakes was that they helped with fertility with women. If you had the mandrakes, there was something in them and they would help you have kids. So he finds these mandrakes in the field and he brought them to his mother Leah. Now, his mother Leah had already had 4 kids. It says, Then Rachel saw this and said to Leah, Please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But Leah said to her, Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? Now, here's what she means by that. Because again, Jacob married Leah first. Now, it was a day early, but still, he married Leah first. But apparently Rachel had told Jacob, you may not, after the 4th kid, you can't have sex with her anymore. And so, for some reason, it was okay to have sex with the maid, have sex with everybody else, but just not my sister. So when she says, You've taken away my husband, you're going to take away my son's mandrakes too? How dare you? And Rachel said, Therefore, he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes. So apparently it was up to her. Okay, I will let him, if you give me those mandrakes, because she's basically saying, I haven't had any kids. Everybody been having kids. Leah's had kids. Bill has had 2 kids. Zilpah has 2 kids. I've had no kids. So give me those mandrakes. I feel left out. And so I will let you sleep with him tonight. And literally she just meant tonight. One night. That's it. You can have one night. So in verse 16, it says, When Jacob came out of the field in the evening, Leah went out to him to meet him and said, You must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes. So I have paid for this night. And he lay with her that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a 5th son, just that one night. And Leah said, God has given me my wages. He's paid me. He's given me my reward because I have given my maid to my husband. So she called his name Issachar, which means wages, which means reward, like payment. Okay. Now, here's the prophecies about Issachar, because this is the fifth son of Leah. And again, Leah, God is on Leah's side, giving her Levi and Jacob, and her sons tended to prosper. So it says Issachar is a strong donkey, lying down between two burdens. Here's what the translation of that would be. Issachar is like a donkey who is laying down between two strong things, and he has to decide which way he's going to go. And that was Issachar's dilemma. Even though Issachar was Leah's son and therefore part of the promise that God was doing, he had to choose, which side am I going to go? Which way am I going to go? In 1 Chronicles chapter 12, verse 23, when David is fighting with Saul, God has chosen David, who's a descendant of Judah, to be king. Well, Saul's trying to kill David because he's not having it. Saul's from the tribe of Benjamin. Judah and Benjamin have this amazing history that we'll get to in a couple weeks. So it says, and now these were the numbers of the divisions that were equipped for war in 1 Chronicles 12, verse 23. And he came to David at Hebron to turn over the kingdom of Saul to him, according to the word of the Lord. So these are the people that were going to side with David. In verse 32, it says, of the sons of Issachar, who had understanding of the times, to know what Israel ought to do, their chiefs were 200, and all their brethren were at their command. So he says, Issachar, he didn't say this about anybody else, they had an understanding of the times. Issachar had a special gift and understood which way. It says they understood to know what Israel ought to do. They were the scholars, they were the studiers, they understood the prophecies and everything. It says they brought 200 generals with them, chiefs, generals, and all of their army. It says, we're going to side with David because we know what's going on. We're not siding with Saul. Even though Saul was king and everybody made him king, we know that David should really be king. Another thing he says, though, about Issachar, when he's prophesying over him, not that he'll lay between two, but he'll always have to choose, but he's a donkey who's going to have to choose. It says, he saw that rest was good and that the land was pleasant, which means he was lazy. So even though he has to decide what he should do, he ultimately is going to be lazy and just choose the easy path because he saw that rest was good. And there are donkeys who will just do that. They'll just lay down and say, I'm resting, I'm done for today. And you can pull, I mean, you have that, you're stubborn like a mule. They're not going to get up. They're just resting. So he's saying, he's like a donkey. He's just going to get lazy at one point. So he bowed his shoulder to bear a burden and became a band of slaves. So in the prophecy, he gets so lazy, he's saying that rest was good and that the land is pleasant just to lay down, that he's going to bow his shoulder to bear one of the burdens, because it says he's between two burdens, like which one should I choose? He's going to choose the wrong one and become a band of slaves. Okay, so in 1 Kings chapter 15, remember Issachar was on David's side, and then David has Solomon, and Solomon had Jeroboam, and Jeroboam was a terrible king. David's grandson was terrible. So Rehoboam from the north challenged him. And now Jeroboam and Rehoboam are at war. This is now Nadab, who's the son of Jeroboam, became king over Israel in the second year of Asa, king of Judah, and he reigned over Israel for 2 years. So Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, became king over Israel, the year of Asa, king of Judah, and he reigned over Israel for 2 years. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and he walked in the way of his father, and in the sin by which he had made Israel sin. So he's becoming king up north, and he's a terrible king. It says, then Baasha, the son of Ahijah of the house of Issachar, conspired against him, and Baasha killed him, which at Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines. So he was down there visiting the Philistines one day along the coast, and someone from the tribe of Issachar killed him. It says, while Nadab and all Israel, they laid siege. Meanwhile, they laid siege to Gibbethon. And in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, so Asa's down there, Baasha, the son of Ahijah, became king over Israel. Israel, whenever talking about Israel and Judah, they're talking about north and south. So Israel is the name for the north kingdom. Judah is the name for the southern kingdom. 10 verses 2, really 9 verses 3. Okay, and so while Asa's king in Judah, this descendant of Issachar becomes king over all Israel up in Tirzah in the north. And he says, and it reigned for 24 years. So Issachar's taken over because they understood the times and they knew what to do and they were smart and they took over. However, he did evil in the sight of the Lord because he got lazy and he walked in the way of Jeroboam and in his sin by which he had made Israel sin. So Issachar got lazy. You're going to choose the wrong thing, even though you know better, Issachar, even though you're raised in a good family. And they got carried off into bondage by the Assyrians the first time that the people were carried away. And Issachar basically just disappears. There are some descendants, a few remnants who came back, but they just never came back to the land. So Leah conceived again, and he's now bearing Jacob a 6th son. So she's had 6 sons. She had those first 4, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. She has Issachar, and now she has Zebulon. And Leah said in Genesis 30:20, God has endowed me with a good endowment, and now my husband will dwell with me, because I have bore him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulon, which means dwell. He's going to dwell with me. We're together. And again, she's not saying God has a purpose for him like she did with Judah. Judah's the only one where she went, I'm not in competition with my sister. God gave me this child. God's going to do what he wants. I'm placing this child in God's hands. No. She says, here's what you're going to do, Zebulon. You're going to make my husband do it. So she went back to her old ways. And that affects Zebulon because it never worked. Jacob never fell in love with Leah. So she put, again, another pressure on the child that the child couldn't fulfill. So when in the book of Judges, when all the 12 tribes came back and Joshua's giving out orders and you go here and you go there and you do this, um, there are some people who obeyed, but most of the tribes didn't because they didn't feel connected to that land. They were never taught to be connected to the land, that God has a plan for them. And you have to teach kids or teach your neighbor or teach yourself. God knew you were coming and God has a plan for you and for your life. And they were never taught that. They were taught you're here for this one purpose, to make my husband fall in love with me. And so they just never felt connected to the land that God had given them. So in Judges 1:30, it says, nor did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahaldi. So the Canaanites dwelt among them and were put under tribute. Well, they made them pay money, but still, they they just also they didn't believe that this land was theirs. God said to Abraham, I'm giving you this land. God said to Isaac, I'm giving you this land. God said to Jacob, I'm giving you this land. But they did not teach their children, I'm giving you this land. Only apparently Judah got it. This is your land. So when these other tribes came, they were never told that was their purpose. They were told your purpose is to get my husband back. And when that didn't work, they felt purposeless. So when Judah's saying attack, they're like, I'm going to attack them because they don't know. They didn't know God was on their side. We have to teach people God is on your side. So you don't have to be afraid of this and afraid of that. If God says you can do it, you can do it. So here's one time that they did fight in Judges chapter 6, um, verse 35. It says, but the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. Then he blew the trumpet, and the Abiezrites gathered behind him. Now Gideon is of the tribe of Manasseh, Joseph's kids. And he sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, who also gathered behind him. Remember, Gideon's going to lead this charge against the Midianites. Those are Abraham's other wife, Keturah. Her kids are the Midianites. So he also sent messengers to Asher and to Zebulun and Naphtali, and they came up to meet them. So this is the one fight that Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali actually got involved in, is to help Gideon in that one fight. Otherwise, I'm not in it. So in Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 11 through 13, here's what's happening with these kids. It says Moses commanded the people. So don't forget, uh, Leah has 6 kids: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun. Bilhah has 2 kids: Dan and Naphtali, and Zilpah has 2 kids: Asher and Donder and Pranzer and Vincent. No, I'm just kidding. Can't remember the other one. But anyway, so other than Joseph and Benjamin, 10 of the 12 sons have been born. In Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 11 through 13, when Moses brought back the 12 tribes and they're about to take the land, they're about to go into the promised land. At least Moses thought they were about to go in. He divided them and had them on 2 mountains. And he explained, you've been living under Egyptian rule for the past 400 years, a culture that's all about death. And you don't know anything about life. I want to teach you how to choose life. And sometimes when we're living in the world, or we've been in prison, we've heard all about death our whole lives, and God has to train us. He has to teach us to choose life. So he divides them in 6 tribes. You're going to be in this mountain. You 6 tribes, you're going to be in that mountain. And I am going to explain to you that you'll be blessed if you do these things, and you're going to be cursed if you do these things. And you 6 tribes, every time I pronounce a blessing, you say amen. And you 6 tribes, every time I pronounce a curse, you say amen. What's interesting, which tribes that were chosen to be in the blessing mountain and which tribes that were chosen to be in the cursing mountain. God was up to something. It wasn't just random who he picked to be on one and who he picked to be on the other. Because he wanted those 6 tribes. I need you to get it. You're going to be cursed. I really need you to get it if you do these things. Because he picked the 6 tribes that were in the most danger of screwing up. So in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 11 through 13, it says, and Moses commanded the people on the same day, saying, These shall stand on Mount Gerizim to bless the people. When you have crossed over the Jordan, I want Simeon and Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin. So the 2 kids of Rachel that have yet to be born, Joseph and Benjamin, and the 4 kids of Leah, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, interestingly, not Reuben. You stand on that mountain. It says, and these, in verse 13, these shall stand on Mount Ebal, of course. No, to curse, not of course. To curse Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali. And God was dividing them up. You 6 tribes have a chance. You 6 tribes don't stand a chance unless you get this in your head about these curses that are going to come upon you. So Zebulun was on the cursed mountain, and Issachar was on the blessed mountain. And then it says, afterwards she bore a daughter. So we're back to Leah. Afterwards she bore a daughter, finally. She had 6 sons and a daughter, it says, and called her name Dinah. And we're going to get into next week what happened with Dinah. So I don't have to give you her whole history. We're about to see it coming up. And now she's got 7, and she was done, because 7, God tends to use 7 in the Bible as to say, now it's complete, now it's done. Now here's what's interesting. Dinah was not the only daughter. She was just the only daughter that the Bible talks about. Because in that culture, they just didn't give a lot of credence to women, although God gave credence to women. God raised up Ruth and Esther and Anna the prophet and all these wonderful women. The people who were writing stuff down, they just didn't keep record of the women. But they mentioned Dinah specifically because what happened with her affected the birthrights of her brothers. So what happened with Dinah was part of God's history that he was writing, specifically affected the Messiah and all of that. So that's why they're going to tell her story. We know that he had other daughters because in Genesis 37:35, after Jacob thought that Joseph had been killed, when his brothers made up that story, that lie, in Genesis 37:35, it says, and all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted, and he said, for I shall go down unto my grave to my son in mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Now here's the part that we skipped over. It says all his sons and all his daughters comforted him. So he had more daughters than Dinah, but they're not mentioned. But we know about Dinah, and we're about to read about her. And then I just want to end with this in Genesis chapter 30, verse 22 through 24. It says, then God remembered Rachel. So after Leah has had 7 kids, then God said, okay, Rachel, it's your turn. Just like Jacob worked 7 years for Leah, and then it was Rachel's turn. It says, then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. So she called his name Joseph, which means take away and add. It's really 2 words, Joseph, and it's take away and add, which is interesting that you can take away and add. But he's taking away her reproach, and he's going to add another son. In fact, she prophesied that and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. So she knows that she's had this one son, and she believes there's going to be another. And Joseph is that link. He's taking away my reproach, but he's going to add more to me. So God is doing both through Joseph. So I'm ending there. So we're learning the history of these sons and where they go, because we hear all these stories. I just like to connect them. When Samson is, who is of the tribe of Dan, and he's so horrible, he's fighting the Philistines. He's fighting them in Gaza. They brought him to Gaza all this history connects. It all connects. Um, and the Bible's not a bunch of random stories. It's one long story that all connects. So next week we will now we've done all the history of all these kids, we're going to go through what happened with them, how Jacob got away from Laban eventually, but Laban chased him down, and then he runs into Esau, and all the adventures of Jacob before, and all the things that God is doing to him in order to turn him from Jacob into the man Israel, one who wrestles with God, to somebody who becomes a prince before God, who becomes strong and prevails in God, as opposed to somebody who's constantly the deceiver, the person who thinks he has to get around God. God will do things to us so that we understand we have to work with him, or it's not going to work. We have to work with him. Okay. So thank you so much for tuning in. And I will see you again this Wednesday, or some of you, I'll see you on Sunday. All right. Bye-bye.